Comics.
Boneless Comics Podcast.
Boneless Comics Podcast.
We like
Comics.
because they have no bones.
I am Joe Getcho,
And I'm Mike White.
and we represent the offices of We Like Comics because they have no bones. And unlike our previous episode, this time you will like us when we're angry.
Yes, thank you everybody for joining if this is your first time listening. As the name suggests, we are a comic book podcast that celebrates all things DC, Marvel, Image, Dark Horse, IDW, and more. Each episode we pick a comic book or comic-related show and movie and review it, taking you on an exciting adventure to learn more. This is also a clean show, so we'll generally be keeping it PG-13. And if you want to look us up on social media, you can find us at Boneless Comics Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, and Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter.
That's right. And for Exhibit B, our YouTube channel is at tinyurl.com/boneless comics podcast. And that contains additional records of each episode, an after show for each episode where we continue the discussion, extra Spider-Man content on episodes of Spidey Joe's one-shots, and we store additional evidence in the form of bonus music, trailers, and more, all related to this podcast.
Yeah, so today we're going to be covering She-Hulk Single Green Female, which collects She-Hulk issues number 1 through 6, published by Marvel Comics in 2004, written by Dan Slott and penciled by Juan Bobillo. This is not the run from 2005, which is technically the third trade in Slott's run on She-Hulk, which, due to a goof on Joe's part, we will actually be covering in part 2 of this episode. But Joe's goof means more She-Hulk for you guys, so get excited.
All right. And get angry.
That's
Well,
right.
maybe not too angry.
Eh.
So first, I'd like to present the writer of this comic, Dan Slott, who's an American comic book writer from New York City. He is not a lawyer, but he's one of those big names in the comic industry who's not just written a lot of comics, but a lot of comics. But he's won several awards for his writing of specific stories, including for Silver Surfer, Amazing Spider-Man, and Superior Spider-Man, which actually was one of my favorite Spider-Man runs. Fight me if you want to, but we can talk on Twitter. But those awards go back as far as 2012, whereas the events we're going to discuss today are actually from 2004, during the time where Slott was working for DC Comics, writing stories for Batman Adventures and Justice League Adventures, and a new, at the time in 2003, miniseries called Arkham Asylum Living Hell. And then in 2004, he also wrote the fourth parallel storyline for the Justice League, which introduced a character called the Red King.
Huh.
I have not read this, but this is what I have found. So.
I didn't know he did anything for DC. So those titles are the comic adaptations of those animated shows, I believe. So Batman Adventures would be like Batman the Animated Series. Justice League Adventures would be Justice League the Animated Series. So that's kind of cool that it's set within. That's like the pocket of DC that you know pretty well. So that's kind of neat.
Yeah. So that's really where we are with Dan Slott and his career. And that's something that he started off doing, like even back, even earlier in the early 1990s, when Marvel Comics optioned the rights to produce comic books based on Nickelodeon properties. Dan Slott actually wrote a majority of the 44 issues that were produced, along with specials under the Marvel Absurd imprint. And so there's a couple examples I have here. Ren and Stimpy special number 3, Masters of Time and Space, was set up as a choose your own adventure book with a time travel plot, which took Slott 6 months to plot out in his spare time. And it was designed so you could choose a path that would eventually be 20 pages longer than the comic itself. Pretty smart. And then issue number 6 of the series starred Spider-Man battling Powdered Toast Man, who is a melodramatic superhero and spokesperson for Powdered Toast, the breakfast treat that tastes just like sawdust. And Slott also wrote other children's comics for DC, including Scooby-Doo, Looney Tunes, and Powerpuff Girls. So this is what he was doing before he came to write She-Hulk.
What's incredible about that is that you have just unlocked a memory that I have not thought about in probably 20, 30 years, because I definitely owned that Spider-Man versus Powdered Toast Man comic back in the day. I remember reading it. I haven't thought about it in, since the 90s, but I remember as you were describing it, I'm like, oh my gosh, I think I've read this. And they end up teaming up and they become friends, and it's like a superhero team up, and And I don't remember much about it except that it was absurd, which seems to go with the imprint. But
Sure.
that's totally crazy because I never thought that that would surface again. I mean, I've just completely locked that memory away or blocked it out. So
All right.
that's pretty cool. I had a much harder time finding stuff on the next witness that we're going to call to the stand, which is Juan Bobillo. He is an Argentinian penciler whose most famous works include She-Hulk, which we're obviously talking about today, Howard the Duck, Thunderbolts, and Astonishing X-Men. So mainly a Marvel guy, it seems like, from the research that I did. He was born January 1st, 1975 in Buenos Aires, and there's very little about him online because he doesn't have a Wikipedia page, and his bios on the DC and Marvel.com pages are kind of just like his work history. So that's really all that I can tell you about him. His style is really cartoony, but he still adheres to every character's sort of design standard. I would just say that they're a little bit wider, especially in the face, than what you would expect for a lot of other comic book pencilers. So that may be
Yeah.
something that some people don't care for. I think it worked really well for She-Hulk herself, particularly in the early issues. She's really big and she's got a lot of muscle mass whenever she transforms, and they show like a big transition between like her petite sort of like mousy lawyer form of Jennifer Walters versus how she looks when she's all hulked out. So it was kind of cool to have more of like a full figured superhero woman for a lot of this, although there are some guest artists that would take it in one other direction or another. She has really big biceps that look like they can do real damage, but then her arms kind of come to like a smaller point, which I guess is just like a stylistic choice. But I personally, I like this. I think I like it more than the CG designs that I've seen for the She-Hulk show because she looks a little bit more like she could do some damage, whereas those seem to be airing a little more on the feminine side. And I think she can look feminine and still be really muscular. You know what I mean? So I think the comic book leans into that a little bit better than maybe what I've seen of the CG. There actually was some discussion on the show about the animators saying we wanted to bulk her up, and Disney
Yeah.
told us to go more petite with her. And then there was the fan backlash, and so now they've kind of gone the other direction and bulked her up a little bit more. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that plays out. But ultimately, this kind of reminded me of like the Pixar animation style, where everybody has they have like recognizable and realistic facial expressions, but they're just exaggerated, and it fits very well with that kind of animation or cartoony kind of look. So I was a fan of it.
Yeah, I agree with the cartoony definitely. And what you're saying before about like how wide their eyes are on their heads, it
Mm-hmm.
almost looked to me like they had this big head and then they had like a small little section of their face that's where their eyes, nose, and mouth were.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that, especially in the close-up panels of like their facial reactions. But
Mm-hmm.
I thought like She-Hulk looked a little more, because I think at one point they say she's like 7 feet tall, but there's a lot of scenes where she's almost the same height as some other people in the room that are probably more like, 5.5 to 6 feet tall. And
Right.
then the worst thing about the art from my perspective was Spider-Man. He looks like a really thin kid with a like big baggy shirt on. Like it's just like
Mm.
straight down and his sleeves are long I did not like the way that Spider-Man was drawn in this, but this isn't one of those art styles that like it makes it hard to read because it's so bad. It's not bad. It's
Yeah.
just like I think it does match the comedic nature of the book a little bit. And so some things sort of look a little cartoony or jokey just in the way that they're drawn, but it's not something that takes you out of the story because you're like, wow, what's wrong with that person's face? It's
Right.
just more of a critique than anything else.
Right.
But I also did have another critique that Mrs. Book in the last issue, and I'll show you a screenshot of this. Basically, she looks like Vecna, or the guy, who plays Vecna from Stranger Things, not in the monster form, but in his like number one, in his white outfit. They look
Mm-hmm.
a lot alike. So not sure what happened there, but kind of creepy.
That obviously could not have been planned because this came
No.
out 15 years ago. So I guess a little bit of background on She-Hulk herself for everybody that doesn't know. She was created in February 1980 by Stan Lee and John Buscema. although Lee only penned the first issue and then handed it off to other writers afterwards. So she was created to capitalize on the success of the Bionic Woman and the Incredible Hulk TV series, though. And the feeling was that they needed to secure rights to a female Hulk character before it was done on the TV show or somewhere else, and then they wouldn't get royalties for it.
Pretty
So
typical.
yeah, it was a business decision creating her.
Yeah.
And I think that's evidenced by Lee leaving the book so early too, because it was really kind of like, he's like, I'm fine getting royalties for creating her, but I don't really want to spend time writing the book. So, but hand it off to somebody else. But She-Hulk is Jennifer Walters, the shy lawyer and daughter of Los Angeles County Sheriff William Walters. And after attempting to stop a hit on her father, Jennifer is shot. And the only available donor for blood transfusion was her cousin, Bruce Banner, better known as the Hulk. So while this blood transfusion saved Jennifer's life, it also transformed her into the superpowered heroine, She-Hulk. Having all the Hulk's strengths, Jennifer is largely in control of her transformations and has served as a valued member of various teams, most notably the Fantastic Four and the Avengers, while still juggling her legal career.
All right. Well, let's take a quick break, but in the meantime, you can watch this clip from the Incredible Hulk cartoon of 1982, where we see Jen Walters turning into the She-Hulk.
Hydra. Jen Walters could never catch him in time, but Jen Walters doesn't have to.
Welcome back, everybody. So the story today that we're covering is far past her origin, so a little bit further down the timeline from 2004. And Jen Walters here is the district attorney of New York, or at least working for them. She's also on the Avengers and is an avid party girl until she's kicked out of the Avengers Tower, not the group, just their living space, and fired from her job for saving the world from disaster. She's then recruited by Goodman, Lieber, Kurtzberg, and Holloway, who basically from here on out, we're going to call GLK&H because that's a lot easier, a prestigious law firm that is well known for its superhuman law division. At GLK&H, she slowly begins to realize there are things that Jen Walters can do that She-Hulk can't, and begins to accept herself for who she is when she's not a superhero, an intelligent, accomplished lawyer that can save people in the courtroom as well. And I know you have issue with how I said lawyer.
That's okay. I will see you in a court of law once I have my lawyer.
Gonna have to settle this
one day.
Because this is how the real Civil War is going to happen.
Oh, yeah, that's right. The Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
I feel a storm brewing.
So it's funny, working for the district attorney of New York, this is actually Blake Tower, who they name drop either in this volume or in the later volume, but they name drop him at some point. And it's funny because my wife and I just finished rewatching Daredevil season 3, and Blake Tower is actually a character who is the DA for, I think, seasons 2 and 3. In season 1, he's like the assistant DA. So it was kind of neat just to hear these like little references of things that are, that I've been hearing lately. Obviously it's a different character because in She-Hulk he seems to be this like, old guy almost ready for retirement with a receding hairline and kind of sniveling and no backbone.
Yeah.
But he is definitely not that character in the Daredevil show that was previously on Netflix. It's now on Disney Plus, but I just wanted to throw that out there. But it's kind of funny because like I haven't read this, so it was all new to me, but there were a lot of little bits and pieces that I picked up on that either I've seen or heard in Daredevil or just in the general Marvel universe, or actually in volume 3, some things that they showed on Loki on Disney Plus. So it's kind of neat to have all these familiar things in here that I, didn't expect to see.
Yeah.
I think for most people, there's a lot of criticism on this volume because people say that basically Jennifer Walters is Ally McBeal with muscles. I've never watched that show, but it seemed like there was a lot of drama and over sexualization in that, as well as, I don't know, like other things. But
I think that's where Lucy Liu got her start, as well as like Callista Flockhart, who eventually ended up on Supergirl.
Yeah. So I don't necessarily agree with those criticisms. We definitely start there because Jen
Hmm.
is living in the Avengers Tower and she's making a mess out of things and having too many parties and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
And she's, sleeping with some model who has no, well, he says she has no depth, but
He's pretty
whatever.
dumb too.
Yeah, exactly. So we get a lot of that at the beginning, but that's really
Hmm.
just to show you where she's at. And then through the events really of the first issue, I think she gets kicked out of the Avengers Tower and she
Hmm.
starts to be a little more responsible. And we don't really get a whole lot of sexualization, especially like Jessica Drew, Spider Woman. It's like through all the way throughout. Whereas in this, I felt like if it happened, it was just, here and there, but it wasn't something that was just like drastically in your face, except for the beginning, but it was there on purpose to prove a point.
Well, it feels more like a natural part of the story than exploitation in
Hmm.
this story. I feel like, and so the way that She-Hulk has really been represented in the comics beyond her initial run is that becoming She-Hulk more lowers her inhibitions than it does make her into a rage monster. So
Right.
Banner has that struggle of like losing control and breaking stuff and hurting people. And that's not really She-Hulk's thing so much. It's more that she enjoys the power, she enjoys the liberating part of being this superhero and living this other life, and she doesn't want to go back to being her boring self.
Hmm.
So really a lot of this story is the struggle of her with finding a balance between her two identities and accepting that there actually are things that Jennifer Walters can do that She-Hulk can't. And that's a big revelation because even from her first appearance, which they actually flash back to at one point during this run, she said basically says whatever Jennifer Walters can't do, She-Hulk will. And that was kind of her, the beginning of her character where she's like, well,
Hmm.
I'm gonna take everything up to 11. And this story really kind of pulls her back down to earth a little bit more. And what I can see fans maybe not liking is that it concentrates more on the courtroom drama than it does superhero action. So I can see that maybe turning off some people that were expecting a book where she was just beating down bad guys and there was a lot of action. But I think that Dan Slott sprinkles it in enough throughout, and there's enough crazy superhero stuff going on, even though most of it takes place in courts, that I think you can still feel like this is very set in the Marvel universe. And kind of like you were saying earlier with that character being referenced from Daredevil, almost every issue feels like it's pulling something in from another part of Marvel. So this
Hmm.
book feels very connected to that universe, like the Roxxon Corporation or Spider-Man and the Daily Bugle and things like that. It just there's even a prison that they reference later on, the big house where they've shrunk down
Hmm.
all the criminals. That's something that they were doing, in the Avengers title at the time. So it's very connected to the world at large.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting for a character with a sort of generic name like She-Hulk. She's basically a
Mm-hmm.
Hulk that's a she, but that's far from the truth because the whole I think what people gravitate towards in these stories is that, Jen Walters is wrestling with this other part of her personality, but it's very much something that's a part of her. And it's almost more simultaneous because a lot of heroes, they have the secret identities and they have their superhero identity where they're out in public and they save lives and do all that stuff. And then they have their sort of more personal identity where they keep that completely separate and they may even act differently and that sort of thing. And Jen, while she does act differently as She-Hulk, it's very much public that Jennifer Walters is She-Hulk. And
Mm-hmm.
and because she's really the same person, it's just more of like, is she in a frail human looking body or is she in a giant athletic looking body? But it's really the same person.
Right.
And so because she's in this She-Hulk form, it like lowers her inhibitions to where she has a lot more confidence because she's in this, big, strong, athletic body, but it's still her. It's not like
Mm-hmm.
another identity that she's taking on, but it still feels different because she can go from human to Hulk and back and forth with basically it seems like no effort and no
Yeah.
time or anything. So it's interesting because she's like, well, why would I ever want to be in that frail human form? Because then I'm vulnerable. And if I'm
Mm-hmm.
really the same person, then why don't I just stay as She-Hulk all the time? Because if there's no consequences, like, it doesn't wear me out and it doesn't hurt and anything like that,
Right.
then why not? And it's interesting for a character arc to see her like it's more reconciling who she is apart from what she can do, but it's all
Mm-hmm.
simultaneous. It's not like, Peter Parker is who I am, but Spider-Man is what I can do, or vice versa. Spider-Man's really who I am, but Peter Parker is who I have to be to protect the ones that I love.
Right.
With Jen
Right.
Walters, it's like, yeah, I'm Jen Walters, I'm She-Hulk, and that's, I am Iron Man. It's very public.
I am Iron Man.
You do see, though, at least in the first issue, how her Avengers persona or her Avengers career does actively interfere with her practicing law, though,
Mm-hmm.
because she is, working for the DA, and in the middle of her closing arguments, an Avengers emergency happens, and she's like, "Sorry, guys, I have to go into space and fight MODOK." And the judge is just like, "Well, all right, I guess that's a wrap. You'll have to come back later and finish the court case, but obviously that has to take priority because we don't want to die." So the argument is made that her saving the world in the middle of the trial actually impacted the jury's decision in her favor because she just saved all of their lives, and that's actually what gets her fired. So
Mm-hmm.
there is some conflict between her two careers as a superhero and as a lawyer. But the deal that she makes with Holden Holloway, who is the really her main contact and her boss at the new law firm, is that she has to remain Jennifer Walters while she's within the building working and while she's trying court cases and everything. And so that really challenges her because she's like, wait, I can't be all big and strong and everything. And so that's where the her sort of unease starts to come in. Like, well, what am I going to do if somebody comes and tries to beat me down or whatever? But I think, doesn't she go to Scarlet Witch? Scarlet Witch like puts a hex on her that's like, if anybody wishes Jennifer Walters harm or wishes She-Hulk harm, then they won't recognize you as Jennifer Walters. And so that's actually a story point that we're not gonna really follow up on until the third trade, so we'll kind of save that for later. But that is important to remember moving forward.
Yeah. So we do have a lot of courtroom stuff that happens, and
Mm-hmm.
we also have a little bit of fourth wall breaking. And when I heard that, She-Hulk not only was a character that did fourth wall breaking, but also did it before, like Deadpool did, who's really
Yeah.
more famous for it, I don't know, I was a little scared. I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna like this, like a law, Hulk fourth wall breaking. But there really wasn't
Mm-hmm.
a whole lot of it. And really it was more just like things that happened that seemed more like fourth wall breaking rather than her like looking right at the camera and saying, I think she does that at the end of one issue though. She
Yeah.
like looks right at the camera and addresses the reader, which was just, it was funny. It was for comedic value,
Yeah.
but it doesn't undermine the story points to where you're like, this is just completely ridiculous. And it doesn't even take itself seriously.
Mm-hmm.
It's done well enough. And I think the biggest example is that the basement of the new law firm that she goes to work for
Oh
is
yeah.
actually a library of comic books. And they actually explain it within the Marvel universe that Marvel comics are all true and are licensed by the superheroes who star in them. And prior to 2002, were certified by the Comics Code Authority, a government agency, and are therefore admissible in any courtroom in the United States. So they actually use these comic books to do research, to get information, to review historic events, and they can actually bring them into the courtroom and submit them as evidence and say, the events that happened in this book right here, this is something that proves that, this character was running amok and doing this and that. And it's like fourth wall breaking, but it's kind of not, because they explain it within the continuity of the Marvel
Mm-hmm.
universe. But it's just like one of those things that like it sounds outlandish, but at the same time it makes for very interesting storytelling, because now you've got somebody with a bunch of comics walking into a courtroom, like, and that's really the type of like courtroom antics that we see is, we see a
Mm-hmm.
giant Hulk obviously, but we also see all these super powered people, because she is an attorney, she works for a law firm that defends super powered individuals. so right now we're already in a different realm than like Daredevil, because him being a lawyer, he also practices law as a lawyer, and he goes to a courtroom, and but it's not the same. She's not a Daredevil copy. Like, she's her
Right.
own character. She's completely different, and they defend superpowered people, and that really gives you a whole new level of storytelling that you can go into, because now you have all these like wacky events and that you're trying to defend, and you have to come up with creative ways to make them work. And that's the really neat part of it. But I'm really interested to read Charles Sewell's run on this, because he actually was a lawyer at one point, and it would be interesting just to see that perspective and kind of compare that to this, because
Hmm.
Dan Slott, definitely not a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. I'm sitting in a fake courtroom, so I'm not an
That's
actual
not
lawyer.
real.
No, it's a green
Oh.
screen, but I did a little bit of research, and things like the Comics Code Authority, they're not actually a government agency, but that's how like basically Hollywood and everybody works in fiction. Is you take something, it's like science fiction, you take something that's in the real world, and you sort of tweak it to make it fit within your story, to make it more interesting. So there's a lot of that in this, but there's also a lot of inconsistencies for Dan Slott not actually being an attorney, and understanding maybe a lot of the concepts that he's putting forth, just
Hmm.
kind of making them work within the story. So this isn't necessarily something that if you read it, it's going to be like a smart courtroom drama. It's just kind of more interesting, and it's about the characters and that sort of thing, but you won't really get
Hmm.
caught up in the legalese in this, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
I didn't notice any of you. You called out a few things in your notes that you're like, well, this isn't how it would work in a real courtroom, and things like that. And I didn't really notice any of that because I was so invested in
Right.
like the character stories that were going on, and so that stuff didn't really matter. There is actually a YouTuber, and I can't think of his name, but he always says, "Hi, legal eagles," and he then basically picks apart legal proceedings from various forms of media. So it
Mm.
would be he did the Measure of a Man from Star Trek: The Next Generation,
Ah.
where Data has to prove that he's sentient, and that was really interesting to hear him kind of break that down. So it would actually be fascinating for him to look at this book and go like, okay, here's where they did things that aren't ethical or they don't actually go through the regular court system, but it's I think that the story is entertaining enough that you can just ignore that stuff and it's not going to bother you.
Yeah,
So,
unless you're familiar with actual law practices, it's something that'll probably just go right out over your head, because
right.
he makes it sound plausible enough that you're like, "Oh, okay, the Code
Mhm.
Authority regulates this, so it's admissible in court because it's regulated." That's enough for most people to say, "Okay, sounds plausible," but
Right.
in the real world, no, you can't take comics into a courtroom. It'd be like hearsay, but
Yeah,
that's okay.
so and I mean there are a couple of other sort of nods to Marvel lore. I mean the biggest one is that they have an apartment building provided for them by the firm called the Excelsior.
Excelsior! Oh, someday I'll find out what that means.
Giving giving Stanley his props there for being involved in her creation.
Yeah.
And Jennifer Walters also starts dating John Jameson, the son of J. Jonah Jameson, in the first trade.
Yeah,
And
that one surprised the heck out of me. I was like, "Wait, John Jameson, the Man Wolf? What,
yeah,
she's dating him?"
yeah.
And then I found out they eventually get married. Like, I don't know, it just seems so shocking. I guess there's a couple of crossovers, and they actually go through like when they first met, and I think it
Hmm.
was when they were in like the quantum realm or something. And so I had completely missed that, and I didn't realize that there was overlap between the two. So that was kind of neat to see as well.
Yeah.
Like, it's an established character that she's dating, but it's not somebody who's like high profile, on the
Hmm.
Avengers or that sort of thing. So I thought it was like a smart move, but it was very surprising.
Yeah. Well, the first boyfriend that I remember her having it in the old stuff from like the early 80s, there's a guy named Zapper, and he shows up and has kind of a cameo in the third trade that we're gonna get to later. But the other one that I remember really strongly is Wyatt Wingfoot, who's sort of a sidekick or tag along guy that is just like from a Native American reservation that is friends with the Fantastic Four and Johnny. And so she starts dating him during her years where she was on the FF. And they eventually call back to that at one point as well, which is kind of nice. So, but yeah, her boyfriend for this one is John Jameson, who's an astronaut and the son of the guy in charge of the Daily Bugle. I don't think we see him transform into Man-Wolf in this. I
No,
do
it's a
know that one of
flashback.
the later volumes that is something that happens. There is some craziness involving their marriage, but if you haven't read that yet, I don't want to spoil it because it's pretty entertaining why it happens and then sort of the aftermath of it. But
Okay. There are some interesting characters in here too that I haven't heard of that either were made up for this story or were just in She-Hulk continuity that I hadn't
mhm.
encountered before. We have an individual by the name of Dan Germain, which if you say that really fast, Dan Germain, Dan Danger Man,
Yeah.
that is his name. He is a radioactive man who didn't want powers, but got them due to a work accident. And so he is trying to sue the company because, somebody's got to pay all the medical bills, and like he ends up crushing his wife in bed because he's asleep and he rolls over, and it's causing, all of these issues. And so he wants to get some restitution and also be able to, pay the medical bills and sort of move on with his life, because now he's this like radioactive man. Like he can't just get any job and, go
Mhm.
through life like a regular person. So that's why he comes to the law firm to get some legal counsel, basically.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think he's destroyed his door multiple times and like and several of his shirts and it's you get the impression from seeing him at first the Roxxon Corporation, who's kind of a corrupt oil
Hmm.
baron corporation. I mean, that's what they are. They are like, "Well, it's ridiculous for you to sue us for giving you superpowers. We've improved your life," and but once you start to see how it's affected his home life and how everything's different, and he's just kind of an average guy that wants to work a construction job, it's like, okay, this kind of has destroyed his life. So
Hmm.
it's interesting watching She-Hulk try and find a way to get him money, and I think he ends up getting like a $300 million payout on like her first case. I say She-Hulk, it's actually Jennifer Walters that does
Yeah.
this, but it is kind of a different perspective on the superhero of like, oh, this isn't necessarily always a good thing when you get these crazy powers and your whole life is transformed. So
Well, especially if you're an ape man and you can't help yourself, but when you get upset, you throw poop at people.
yeah, that was a good little nugget that they threw in there.
Ba-doom-ts.
There are all kinds of hilarious asides, and I mean, there's probably way too many for us to mention of
Mhm.
these little vignettes of different lawyers talking to people like Doctor Strange or others about like, well, yes, you caught them doing something illegal, but technically the way you apprehended them was not legal, so we can't prosecute them. And there's a lot of those things that are very funny and I don't know, that was very entertaining to me. Speaking
Yeah.
of Doctor Strange, there's another. This trade actually is very episodic. Just to let everybody know, the one that we're going to be covering later is more of a serialized story that has a long arc throughout. Really, the long arc in this is just Jennifer learning to rest on her knowledge and her ingenuity and find that she can actually help people when she's not a superhero. I think
Mhm.
that's the biggest takeaway for her character from this first trade. But we have all these little sort of one shots within it that are different court cases that she tries. So we have the one with Danger Man where he's suing Roxxon. The second one is really fascinating to me because there is a guy that gets murdered on his job site by going into a giant fan blade and his ghost comes back and says, "Well, I saw who killed me. It wasn't the guy that you're indicting. It's actually my girlfriend." And so that was actually interesting because they had to prove in court that people can die and come back to life for his testimony to be valid. So they're like, well, if there's a possibility this ghost could come back to life, then we have to take his testimony. What's awesome is that at this point in time, I was reading Fantastic Four and Ben Grimm had just been killed in a conflict. And there's this whole story arc that they took Reed through where he was trying to like recreate Doctor Doom's technology to access the afterlife from way back in the day. And eventually they get to heaven and they find Ben, and there's this touching moment where like they ultimately like actually meet God, but he looks like Jack Kirby, like drawing the characters at a
Of
table.
course.
And so he ends up sending Ben back to the world of the living because it wasn't his time to go yet. And he's like, "Oh, can I mean it was kind of a tragic thing because he's like, "Can you put me back as a man?" And he's like, "Sorry, that's not how it works. Got to put you back in your old body." So he's like drawing the segmented plates back onto Ben, and he has to go back as the thing. But it was cool me reading this because they call the thing to the stand as an expert witness on dying and coming back to life. And so because I had read that whole Fantastic Four story, that was really neat feeling like it was tied to the events of this time and seeing him come in and sort of back up Jennifer Walters in court. So yeah, I don't know what you thought of all that, but that landed really well with me because I had read that other stuff they were referencing.
Yeah, they also use the example, and they did the same thing in the MCU that they did in the comics, obviously
Mhm.
differently, but basically the snap where Thanos, basically blinked out half of all the people in the universe, and then it was reversed and they all came back. So it's kind of like, well, everybody, there's like half of the universe's population can get on the stand and attest that they have been dead and come back to life. So that was, I
Right.
think, the final nail in the coffin that convinced the court that this is something that they needed to hear. But
Mhm.
it's interesting because it's not, the guy, he testifies, but he doesn't point out his killer. What he does is he points out his girlfriend because he wants her to get killed so that way she can join him in the afterlife. So very selfish. And it's interesting how they talk about this because they're like, well, think about it, this guy's a ghost, and what does he care if the person that killed him gets it or not? Like, what he wants to do is be able to, move on with his business so that he can go to the afterlife because he's trapped here on Earth. So if
Mhm.
he's going to resolve his business and go to the afterlife, why not, take his girlfriend with him so that way they can be together? But the girlfriend didn't really want to have anything to do with him even before he was killed. So,
Right.
it didn't work out for him, I guess, unfortunately for him, but they do get the real killer in the end.
Yeah, that was a funny one. And then after that, we move into what I'm guessing is probably your favorite chapter in this first trade, only because so Augustus Pugliese, or who they call Pug,
Hmm.
or Pugliese, I don't know how it's pronounced. He's another lawyer at the firm, and he tells Jennifer, he's like, I really want to pay back Spider-Man because he saved me from almost being killed years ago. And she's like, I've got it. We're gonna have him sue J. Jonah Jameson for libel for all the terrible stuff he's printed in the newspapers. And so that issue to me, even not being as big a Spider-Man fan as you, but that issue was just a blast the whole way through because you're seeing all these uncomfortable moments of Jameson being dragged to court. His own son testifies against him. Spider-Man gets up there, and they did something. I was wondering how they were going to get around this. They actually have to prove his identity without exposing his identity.
Hmm.
So they use like an Avengers scanner that's like, yes, this is certified Spider-Man. And
Yeah.
apparently
Good enough.
that's good enough in court. But there were a lot of really hilarious lines in there, especially when they have Spider-Man take the stand and he goes through this spiel about like maybe Jameson hates me because of this and maybe it's that, but I think the real reason he hates me is because I'm black. And then and then you see this panel of Jameson being like, I didn't know. And he's like very uncomfortable. And then, Spider-Man's like, no, I was just kidding. And they kind of the whole audience laughs because of that. But those moments where Spider-Man is quipping, I loved it because it felt like Dan Slott was going, can I just audition to write Spider-Man though, please? Like, can I do that later? Like, I'd really like to write Spider-Man. I feel like that kind of shone through that he loves that character.
Yeah,
So
I think that's one of the biggest general complaints about this volume is that issue in particular is basically a Spider-Man issue and She-Hulk takes
mm,
a back seat. So I can see that if you're tuning in for She-Hulk and you're like, who's the Spider-Man guy? Like, get him out of there. But at the same time, like, you have that in storytelling, like especially in an episodic nature. You're going to have one episode that's really going to be focused on somebody else other than our main character. We give them a little break, but then obviously she's still tied into it and she still has things to do in that episode in that issue. So I don't think that it like detracts, and it's not something where like, Spider-Man takes over the She-Hulk book for like 6 months to a year and you're like, oh man, and then finally She-Hulk comes back. It's nothing like major. It's just one issue where they were trying to have some fun. And yeah, maybe Dan Slott was trying to impress people with the Spider-Man writing. Obviously it worked.
Yeah, obviously.
But I don't think it ruined the volume,
No, I don't either.
And maybe I'm biased, but
Well,
it was still
She-Hulk
fun.
she has a great moment towards the end of that issue where they're fighting the Scorpion together, and she actually ends up arguing with him and getting him to stand down during the fight. She's like, "Look, we're trying to take Jameson for all he's worth right now. If you really hate him for making you into the Scorpion, you won't go in there and kill him. You'll let us sue him for, millions of dollars, because that's going to hit him where he really hurts." And the Scorpion's like, wait a minute. And then while he's thinking about it, Spider-Man comes and knocks him out. And he's like, wow, I've never seen someone argue a supervillain out of fighting before. And so that's so cool though, because that shows how She-Hulk is different, because her skills at arguing and understanding the law and doing sort of persuasive talking were just as useful as her ability to like pound the bad guy into the ground.
Right. And it shows that duality of Jennifer Walters and She-Hulk really is the same person, but it's more of how she conducts herself, in one form or the other.
Right.
Rather than, trying to reconcile. I mean, she does have to reconcile them, but they're not like two opposite sides of a coin. I don't know. It's hard to explain. Like I'm thinking of characters where it's like they have these complete separate identities. And
Bruce Banner and the Hulk seem like two completely different people.
Right. Yeah. This is the opposite of that.
The Hulk is a rage monster. He's out of control. He's, breaking stuff. Even when he is able to speak a little bit for most of his history, not all of his history, because I know you guys are going to get in the comments and tell me I'm wrong. Because wait, what about Gray Hulk when he had his intelligence? I know. But most of his history, he struggles with that. Does the Hulk just wreck everything good about my life? And Bruce Banner is kind of depressed and he's not able to sort of move on and attain the things that he wants because the Hulk ruins it all. And whereas it feels very much like She-Hulk enhances Jennifer's life. She makes it better in a lot of ways and gives her opportunities to do more things. It's just this trade is really about her not losing herself in that power and realizing that she is still Jennifer Walters, even though she's She-Hulk.
Right. And both forms are equally valuable in situations.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I was trying to articulate, but not being able to do it, is that, they're both valuable. She just has to figure out what place that they have. And, since she can transform back and forth, at will, then she can use whichever form in the right situation, and understanding, where is it that Jen Walters fits into this versus She-Hulk. But there was something that like, it didn't necessarily bug me, but it happened so often that it made me think about it. And it's like every time that Jen Walters transfers into the She-Hulk, she basically has this like expandable, shrinkable swimsuit thing that she wears, probably with unstable molecules in it, because that's the explanation for all of that. But it can change size with her. So that way, we don't have this awkward, giant green naked lady every episode, because then it would be over sexualized.
It would.
But, that's totally fine. But every time she does this, she has on her attorney suit and she rips it to shreds. I mean, it's just like just ripped to shreds. And she does this multiple times, like over and over and over. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. So, if you have the swimsuit thing that can change sizes with you, wouldn't you try to get some suits? Because she basically goes through like a set of clothes a day, and maybe she's making the money that she can buy new clothes every single day, but why would you do that? It's just like, and again, it's one of those things that it doesn't destroy the narrative, but it happens so often that I was like, okay, hold up. Like, why is she
messed
ripping
with
her
your
clothes
suspension
again?
of disbelief. It's funny because I feel like that wouldn't be noticeable, except they make a point to bring up Dan Germain's loss of clothing when he transforms earlier. So then you're kind of thinking about it and you're like, wait, but She-Hulk does that every day, And so I honestly think it's got to be in there just for the cool visual of like the ripping and like,
Yeah.
yes, I'm a superhero now. I mean, that's kind of an iconic part of the Hulk character. And so I think that sort of visual language has just translated to what the penciler is doing with her as well. There's probably not more thought behind it than that.
And probably her shoes too. She probably destroys all of her nice, lawyer shoes.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I didn't think about how much money she must need just to sustain her
Yeah,
clothing
just for
budget.
the clothing.
Well, and food too, because in the beginning, Jarvis is feeding her out of giant buckets. I think
yeah.
that was something they talked about. I would think her food bills would be a lot as well. So I don't know. I'm guessing that of the episodic stories, your favorite was probably the Spider-Man one. Would I be right about that? Or
I mean, it was fun. Like I wasn't necessarily reviewing this to, read a Spider-Man story,
right.
but I tried to just think of him as, another client that she's taking on. But
Mm-hmm.
it was definitely fun to see that, we're going after Jameson and, Peter might actually get some money and, get Jameson off of his back for once. And, obviously being a longtime Spider-Man fan, that that's never going to happen, but it was still interesting to pursue that and just sort of see like, okay,
Right.
where can we go with this? And in the end, what happens is in the middle of the trial, basically, they say, well, not just, John Jameson, but we have Peter Parker, who's taken a lot of photos of Spider-Man, who hasn't got, consent for those photos and has even admitted to faking photos in the past and staging them. And, Peter Parker dressing up as Spider-Man, which he is not, or so we think, and taking photos to sell newspapers. So he's just as guilty as Jameson is. So then that's where Spider-Man, has to back off and say, okay, we can't go after Peter Parker because, well, I can't tell you why, but I'm ready to settle. We're done.
Right.
And so it's funny because there's a lot of legal reasons that I found online, Dr. Google, lawyer Google, basically, but as to why this wouldn't, happen in real life. Cause like you can't add a defendant when the trial's already underway, and you can't add a defendant without the client's permission, and nobody's really going to sue Peter Parker anyway because he doesn't have enough money to pay any judgment you might get against him. So it wouldn't really make sense. But at the same time, like, you can't let him sue Jameson because that would just destroy, stories. So
it was very funny though to see him like start to sweat in the courtroom and be like, I don't know if I can do this, guys.
Yeah.
So
what ends up happening instead is that Jameson and Parker get sentenced to dressing up in giant chicken suits and handing out flyers that basically say what, Spider-Man is a good guy and he's not a menace.
It's stuff like Jameson's campaign against Spider-Man was hard boiled. They're all like bad egg puns too, which makes it even more embarrassing.
Yeah.
So that was
a funny way to end it.
Yeah, it was pretty funny.
All right, we're going to take a short recess and then we will be back with you in just a moment.
So once Bruce saved me with that blood transfusion, voila, She-Hulk took center stage.
Order, the court is now back in session here on We Like Comics because they have no bones.
The Honorable Judge Joe Getcho presiding.
Order. All right, so I wanted to talk briefly about Southpaw. So this is a character that I don't know anything about other than she has this like gigantic, I mean, like she's a small girl and she has this gigantic arm on her left arm that's like has some sort of, it has lights on it and it's huge and it has these like, I don't know, force field things that can do and all sorts of stuff. And it's funny, I did want to point out that her name is Southpaw, which is basically, it's a name for somebody who is like a left-handed pitcher or a left-handed boxer. It's kind of like another one of those on the nose names, sort of like Dan Germain, Danger Man. So it was just kind of fun to see those because, She-Hulk being a character that's been around for years and years and years, to have some callbacks to the goofy naming conventions of the 60s.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I like these last two issues that focus on Southpaw and her sort of being a supervillain, but also being the granddaughter of Holden Holloway, who owns Jennifer's firm. The reason I like those is more because this is something that's going to be paid off later. But what this really is the beginning of sort of a forced mentorship between She-Hulk and this girl, where she's supposed to kind of keep her out of trouble with the law. And they end up going through more traditional superheroics in these two issues where they fight a ton of supervillains. And ultimately, Southpaw has to make the decision to turn her back on the supervillains to keep them from killing her grandfather. So that's what makes her kind of turn around. But she goes through some character development here. And as far as I know, this is her first appearance because I think Holden Holloway is also original to this run. So their relationship, she would be new. But yeah, she is a giant, like it almost looks like a
Like a
Green Lantern
claw?
construct or
Oh.
something like mechanical green arm that she has
Mhm.
on, and she can do like energy blasts and obviously punch people with it and do all kinds of stuff. But she's kind of the typical rebellious teenager. Like, I don't want to follow what granddad's doing. And the one thing that I did not care for was that Holloway reveals at this point that, well, I really did just want She-Hulk because I wanted somebody in my firm that was a superhero that could kind of keep my granddaughter in line.
Yeah.
And I felt like that undercut where her character was going in this story a little bit because she had finally really started to grow into her own as Jennifer Walters. And then we put her back in like, well, but we really need you to do the superhero thing. And so I do feel like her character, that development wasn't destroyed, but it weakened it a little bit to have Holloway come in and be like, well, I was actually just kidding before. I need you to Hulk up now.
Yeah.
So,
And I guess, why would he want Jennifer Walters? Like, why would anybody want her if they could have She-Hulk? And
right.
that's sort of like the antithesis of what the story is supposed to be about. Like the story is supposed
Right.
to be about her figuring out, hey, I don't need to be She-Hulk all the time because Jen Walters has a place in this world. And so
Mm-hmm.
by Holloway saying, I only want you to be Jen Walters while you're here in the office building, then that helps with that. And it also kind of keeps her, so people don't see her as an Avenger and superhero. They see her as an attorney, somebody that they're going to take seriously and not pick a fight with because, this is somebody that's representing you. But to undercut it
Mm-hmm.
and say, well, actually, I hired you because you're an Avenger just really feels like it, is the opposite of the message that
Yeah.
they were trying to send within the first 6 issues. So, yeah, I agree with you there.
Yeah, I felt like that just kind of weakened that story. And I don't think it destroys the character development for her personally because she does in the last couple panels, she's kind of like, well, do I still want to work here or not? And she's
Mhm.
kind of like wrestling with that decision. And ultimately the next trade, you find out she does continue to work there. But I guess the difference is that at this point in the story, she had the choice of whether or not she wanted to work there. Whereas in issue one, she basically was at the end of her rope and she didn't have any choice. Like,
Yeah.
if she wanted a job, she had to go work for Holden Holloway and not Hulk out. So I don't know. I just I didn't care for that aspect of it, but her starting to mentor Southpaw is something that pays off later down the line. And it's also fun actually watching She-Hulk throw down some. Although I feel like the more straight ahead superhero style didn't quite fit the book as well in the last two issues as what Juan Bobillo was doing in the first four. So,
I felt like it was a good balance because we had a lot of, courtroom stuff and a lot of character development for
mhm,
She-Hulk in the first couple issues. And then in the last part, it's more of not an action extravaganza, but
mhm.
there's definitely more focus on the action than the courtroom stuff. But it's funny. So they have this like mini prison called the Big House, where basically all of the inmates are shrunk using this gas that has PIM particles in it.
Mhm.
Apparently, the autocorrect in my notes changed this to Pam particles, but they are in fact Pim particles
Yeah,
for
it's
hey
not
Pim.
canola.
Canola oil shrinks the inmates down, and no, so the Pim particles they use those to shrink down the inmates, so they have this like small little model set up where they have all of these cells and they have force fields and all this stuff that keep the villains contained, and they're a lot less threatening because they're smaller. So they end up escaping, but they're still small. And so She-Hulk has to square off against them. And it's actually really funny to see her picking up these, like, people that are like this big, maybe like a couple inches tall, just taking them, grabbing them and flinging them across the room. And at one point she says, "I was never one for playing with dolls." And one of the inmates corrects her and says, "Action figures."
My
So that was
favorite
fun.
moment from all that action was the Namor villain Tiger Shark
Mhm.
appears and she grabs him and flings him into an aquarium and he's like, "Ha, you've empowered me by throwing me into water." And then she drops Electro into the same aquarium and like electrocutes both of them. So I don't know, there were just so many little fun moments in the action like that. So even when she's taking down bad guys and busting heads, it's still got a lot of comedy to it.
Yeah. I thought the comedy in the last half was a little more, I don't know, straightforward, and
Mm-hmm.
it helped sort of supplement the action that was going on. Whereas the comedy in the first half, there were some things that I can't think of any examples, but it didn't seem to land necessarily quite as well.
Hmm.
And I think that's one thing about this story arc, is that if it was maybe a little bit more serious and a little bit less comedic, I think that it would have been better overall. Like, not too serious to where it's very dramatic, but I think that there are a lot of threads that Dan Slott's pulling on for character development and, figuring out where does Jen Walters fit and, all these things. But we sort of keep those down a little bit so that way we still
Mm-hmm.
have the, like, kind of crazy elements, and then we have the inmates escaping later, and that whole thing that happens. So but there's something completely random that happens in issue 6, and I have no idea why. I would be interested to know why, if it was like just a personal connection, or like Dan Slott saw a movie around that time period. But there's this guy sitting on the ground playing the guitar. He looks like Jack Black. And before I even read his dialogue, I thought he looked like Jack Black because he was holding the guitar. But he actually says "tenacious" to somebody who's walking by, and then there's the letter D on his guitar case. And I'm like, okay, what the heck? This is weird. Just like for no reason, one little panel, but
Yeah.
that was pretty funny too.
I don't really know why that's there, but it was funny. But
Mhm.
I don't. Yeah, I don't know why that was there. I don't have any
That
insight
was
into that.
weird. We do get back to a little bit of seriousness, because at the end, the lawyers are questioning the constitutionality of shrinking someone against their will, especially a minor, because apparently Southpaw is a minor. So they call this the right to height. And that's the case that they're bringing against Hank Pym and this mini prison called the Big House.
Mm-hmm.
So even though we had this whole action spectacle, it was really just, background to what was going on with Southpaw and Holloway. But also
Mm-hmm.
we end up back in, not in the courtroom, but we end up focusing on the legal issues. So I think that was a
Mm-hmm.
good, like, bringing it back to home base sort of. But there's not really a conclusion, or, necessarily a character arc that's complete in this story that we get from
Mm-hmm.
She-Hulk. But it's also not over, because we have another
Right.
volume, and then we have a restart to issue 1 again, that's actually called volume 3. And this is where comics get really confusing, because you have to figure out what year it is, what number it is, what volume it is,
This is
and
why we read
what
different
title it is.
stories initially for
Yeah,
the when we were trying to prep for this. So this is why this happened. But it's going to work out for you guys because we'll get to cover another
we'll
She-Hulk
just
story for
talk
you.
about
So
more She-Hulk. Why not?
yeah, that's right.
So yeah, so then we'll see some of this stuff either resolve, or we'll see it kind of continue forward. So this will be
Mm-hmm.
a nice way too to say, well, we didn't have necessarily a full arc, but some of this stuff is going to pay off later, and we can
Mm-hmm.
sort of see that and review that, and talk about that. So I I think that's pretty good about talking about She-Hulk single green female. So
Yeah.
I guess we'll take another recess here. We'll convene, and then we will render a verdict when we return.
Jury is deliberating.
And we're back.
Welcome back, everybody. The jury is back and they're ready to deliver their verdict.
What say you?
So, out of 5 bananas, I think had we not read 2 stories, I would have rated this higher. However, knowing what I know about where this goes, this part of the story, I'm going to give a 3.5 out of 5. The reason is because I initially was going to go with a 4, But as I've thought about it and how her character arc is not really quite resolved here, I think that some of these ideas are better implemented later. And I think as a result, I'm going to have to knock it down just a little bit for that. That said, I really enjoyed this. And it's Dan Slott's run on She-Hulk, just overall, like all 25 or 30 issues or however many it is one of my favorite runs on the character. So I have a lot of love for this era, for this character, but just taking this trade out of time, not connected to anything else, they got to the meat of the issue, which was Jennifer really being at peace with herself and who she is as a person and finding a way to lean on those strengths and not just be a superhero. But they didn't really drive it home in the end. And what Holloway does in the last two issues really kind of undercuts that. And so that's why I'm dropping those 1.5 points. So 3.5 bananas for me.
So when you said that, I kind of looked away and I was like, oh, darn it, because that is exactly the same score that I was going to give this.
Oh, well, hey, when you're right, you're right. You know, the jury has to reach the same verdict for it to be final, right?
So. Oh, there we go. No, but like I agree with all of your points, and not to just like, oh, I agree, I have nothing to contribute, but I actually do, because I thought about this, and I think that it sort of ruined it for me, because I actually read volume 3 first, and then I read volume 1 second. And so coming from volume 3 to volume 1, even though I haven't really read any She-Hulk solo series, I still had the same impression that, like, it wasn't bad. It wasn't middle of the road where it's like, well, some good, some bad. It was definitely better than average, but it wasn't necessarily an exceptional story. It was more of kind of like a rocky start, to where we have some threads to pull on. We have some good ideas. We have some fun storytelling, but we really didn't necessarily go anywhere with it. That, the guy that She-Hulk is sleeping with at the beginning of the story says that she needs more depth. And I think that that is true of the story as well. Not that it's, sleeping around, but I think that it needs more depth, or should have had a little bit more depth. But I think, again, for a volume 1, issue 1 through 6, new writer taking over, it's definitely not bad. It's a good way to sort of get into the series, and you get a lot of representation of what the character's like and what makes her unique to the Marvel universe. But at the same time, volume 3, and I haven't read volume 2, so I can't say, but volume 3 actually does a way better job of proving why Jennifer Walters' She-Hulk is unique to the Marvel universe. That's actually a plot point that they go through. So that one, I guess it is a spoiler already. That one I'm going to rate higher than what I rated this one. Now
Yeah.
I gave it away.
But everybody, stay tuned for part 2. We're going to be talking about She-Hulk Time Trials, which is actually the third trade, but the second number 1 through 6 from Dan Slott and Juan Bobillo. So stay
tuned for more
We like
comics
because they have no